Lauren, how are we?
So good. How are you?
So good as well. That was such a positive start. I feel immediately better. And on that, you are in the market of making people perform better. And I saw a quote on your website, which I thought was interesting, which is that mental toughness doesn't make you invincible. It makes you adaptable, which is something I massively buy into personally as well. So do you just want to explain to us what that means to you?
I just think that, life is just the cycle of darkness and light. And what I've learned is that the only way through the difficult times is through it. And when it comes to mental toughness, it doesn't mean we're going to eliminate failure. It doesn't mean we're not going to eliminate bad times. It doesn't mean we're going to eliminate having a bad result. But where mental performance actually fits in is in our response to those things. And the better our response, the more adaptable we can become and the less impact we can have on our overall outcomes.
So exposure to difficulty is at the core of performing better over a long period of time, I would imagine.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's so much research that backs this, but you can't be comfortable and grow at the same time. And difficulty is a part of that, right? And there can be difficulty we choose, and then there's difficulty we don't choose. But either way, our brain still processes difficult as difficult. And when we push those boundaries, almost like a rubber band, and we pull it, like a rubber band sitting on a desk doesn't offer much value. But when you actually begin to stretch it, that's when we can find many uses for it.
So the qualifications you developed in this space over the years have obviously come from a fascination with it. Where did that application, from an academic point of view, where was that spark triggered growing up that developed this interest?
Honestly, I've always been an athlete. I grew up in athletics and I fell in love with it. I think because it was equal challenge as it was fun. And it was my third game in my senior year when I received my fifth concussion, and I played soccer, and I was told, it's not safe for me to play anymore. And I was devastated for, a lot of reasons, but I ended up finding this elective course in sports psychology. And at the time I was going, to school to get a degree in kinesiology. I thought I was going to be a physical therapist. And I just fell completely in love with this course. It was as if somebody held a mirror up to me and showed me all the things that I could have done to make me a better athlete or a better student or a better, just person in my own life. And I had this moment, especially relating to sports, where I was like, oh my gosh, who would I have been if I would have known these things? And then I thought, how many people can I help now that I do? And so that's really what sparked that motivation to then go on and get my master's degree in performance psychology and do the work that I do.
So it's fascinating that you mentioned that, because my rugby career stopped as a result of my fourth concussion in 3 weeks. So it was before concussions were taken seriously, and my second one was actually undiagnosed because it was whilst we were, let's say, fooling around at a water park on a rugby tour. So because it didn't happen in a rugby match, nobody took it as it could be a concussion, even though I smashed my head off the floor. So I went back onto the pitch for my final rugby game effectively, and that was a pretty bad experience. And I discovered self-driven performance out with a team setting as a result of being forced to do so through concussions, which is a similarity I didn't expect us to have here. So it's we could probably go down a big rabbit hole of concussion discussion, because concussion discussion, what a fun little phrase that is.
I was going to say, now look at that.
And but I think that's a whole separate podcast in itself. But from an academic point of view, what was it that you were drawn to from a modular point of view? Because it's such an incredible world of understanding. I've got a friend who actually helps consult with one of the businesses that we run, who is doing his PhD in sports psychology currently. He's a rugby player. He's fascinated by it. He's had some fantastic tools that he's implemented me for ultra endurance work. And we've used those with clients. We've used those with friends and other athletes. And his understanding of the theory behind making the complex simple is where I think the art of this truly is. So what was it along the way in your the academic section of your career that you really found fascinating?
I call it the weed in the root. I found that a lot of the things that drew me into sports psychology were the weed, right? These are the things that we see. This is how a lot of our problems, quote unquote, get expressed. It's the part of the problem we see. But what I began to learn is that the problem is rarely the problem. The problem is often our relationship to the problem. So my problem was not lack of confidence. My problem was thinking that I needed it to perform well. Like, my problem wasn't the fact that I wasn't worthy, or that because I didn't have a good outcome, I wasn't good enough to be on the team. The problem was I allowed that to drag me down and hold me back to the point where I wasn't able to show up as the best version of me. And so I started to see, the problem in my understanding of it was so surface and singular that when I began to dig deep and understand some of these frameworks behind the problems that presented themselves, from an athletic perspective, from a personal perspective, I started to learn that I had control in them. Like, I had a voice, I had a decision, I had a choice in the matter. And I think that's the part that really just started to open my eyes.
From a personal point of view, how much did that illuminate your day-to-day life as well as your athletic life? Because it's easy to look at stepping onto a pitch and how you perform in that setting as quite binary in terms of the things you just mentioned, but essentially day-to-day life is the weed in the root, isn't it? It's our relationship to the problems that we face on a day-to-day basis. So did you find that your actual studying, your relationships, your day-to-day happiness was all much more transparent for you to understand as a result of learning about this stuff theoretically?
Absolutely. Actually, one of the biggest kind of ahas I had for myself was I started to learn, and I coined this for myself as temporary worthiness. I learned that I attached my worth to my outcomes, whether it was in school, whether it was in my personal life, whether it was soccer. And so, for instance, we'll just take soccer, for example. When I performed really well, I was super worthy. Like, I was like on cloud nine. But the second I had a bad game, I was worthless. And it's partially why I'm really driven and hardworking, because I put a lot of effort, but you can't effort your way out of feeling unworthy. And so when I started to learn that, I started to see how, like, the bridges to my personal life. Oh, when this happens, I feel less worthy. Oh, I didn't realize I attached so much weight to this outcome or this relationship or how I was spoken to in this way. And I started to learn that, I can't really separate like the neural connections and the brain connections I've created in sport, while you're saying, are so much easier to pay attention to because it's in this one arena. I started to realize that they bled into every area of my life. And so then I started to see all the opportunities I had to actually practice rewiring a better connection and upgrading my default settings.
It's like success is so conventionally measured in bank account balance because it's the easiest, most obvious thing to measure, isn't it? Whereas the misconception, the fallacy is that is inextricably linked with happiness, whereas the two are actually separate. So for you, I guess it was a case of understanding that your performance on a sporting field did not define who you were as a person, and separating those things, I can imagine, is the key to actually unlocking the next level, because it means you can be at peace and a bit more objective with things. From a sporting performance point of view, the question I always ask myself, and I'd be interested to get your take on this actually, because this is kind of a phrase I use very often online, is the question I ask myself with any event is, have I done everything that I could with the context I had available to me to be stood here at the starting line? And if the answer is yes, whatever happens, happens, and I'm genuinely at peace with it, there'll be, I wish I'd done this, I wish I'd done that, and all these things that we'll normally do. But I do genuinely believe if something doesn't go my way, if I fall short, if I fail, however you want to label it, I am actually, from an intrinsic point of view, at peace with it. And I encourage people, through my own bias in that experience, to try and view their first Ironman, their first marathon, whatever it might be, in the same way, because it means that you can enjoy the process of learning about yourself along the way and then embrace the experience itself. So do you think that's a good outlook, or do you think that's potentially giving people a way out of performing their best, depending on how applied their mindset is when it comes to actually performing on, we'll call it, game day?
I think the only way that becomes a negative is if you are not honest with yourself. Because I think that what I find is when people use it as an out, it's because they're not willing to look in the mirror and accept honesty. But when you can be honest with yourself and go, did I do everything within my control leading up to this point? Well, then let's see where the chips fall. That to me is amazing, because then what you're doing is you're separating the difference between your decision quality and your outcome quality. And what we know about outcomes and results is that it doesn't just require you to get it. Outcomes and results are are a mix of a couple different things. It's things within your control, things outside of your control, and luck. And so a lot of times we will dismiss things that are not within our control when we're successful. Because we're like, oh, I did everything right. But I think one way to keep yourself really grounded in your growth is by asking, like, where might have luck played a role? What outside circumstances may have, leaned in my favor? And then the opposite is true. When you don't have a good result, like, hey, where may have luck played a role? Maybe it did play a role in your favor and you still didn't get the outcome, or maybe it didn't. And then what outside factors, like your point, things that you didn't have information of at the very beginning, where did those come into play? And maybe it isn't. Maybe it does lean heavily on your decision making, but then you have a place to evaluate it. But I do think you have to separate the two. The outcome quality versus the decision quality, and the things within your control fall into that decision quality piece.
No, it's a fantastic and fascinating way of sort of separating the two, because, I mean, for context from my end, I'm just selfishly using this as a chance to learn some lessons myself.
I love it.
I am, as of, what are we now? 4:15, as of about 3 weeks and some hours within the context of today away from running 250K in one go. And I am very much wrestling at the moment with all of the things. Have I made every decision along the way that has moved me in the right direction, et cetera, and becoming more at peace with the fact of the amount of variables. If I can, on a spreadsheet, if we as a team can map out the variables and how we respond to them with an A strategy, a B strategy, a C strategy, and plan as effectively as we can, it's giving me more peace and comfort and giving me the ability to sleep comfortably at night again around the scale of what's coming in front of me. So the decision quality and the outcome quality is a great way of looking at it, because the outcome quality, a lot of it's not up to me, which if I can come to terms with, makes the whole process a lot less intimidating, which I'm hoping will be what helps me unlock the application to just doing what needs to be done, which I've done in the past with other big endurance events. But this one's intimidating me because it's coming during a period of a very, very busy workload, lots of things going on. We've got new hires, lots of really positive, exciting things, but I feel more stretched than I ever have, which means my mindset is drifting towards thinking I have more control over certain things than I might do, which can create a bit of a negative feedback loop in terms of how I'm approaching my day-to-day training, how I'm approaching my day-to-day value and priorities. And this conversation has come at a fantastic time, because I'm in a real recalibration point. And tomorrow I run 50K in the morning, and on Sunday I run 50K in the morning.
Wow.
And that is my peak before I then need to just accept the work is done and try and be comfortable with that. So there's a lot you've already said, which is really helping me come to terms with my own poor decision making being here, I guess. But yeah, that's decision quality and outcome quality is a great way of looking at it.
Yeah, well, because I think that when the things that are outside of your control, when you attempt to control them, they begin to control you. They control, sometimes it shows up physiologically, where suddenly you feel your heart rate increase, your anxiety increase, that worry increase. And those, when you give effort to things outside of your control, your effort is wasted to some degree. And now it doesn't mean that we don't need to look at them. It doesn't mean that we don't need to consider them, because considering those things may actually change what we do within our control. But controlling those, what you're doing is you're lowering your solution efficiency, because now your attention is split between things you can actually affect and things that you can't. And so it's, whenever I look at efficiency and I look at people that are really good at what they do, it doesn't mean that they don't have problems, but they're really efficient at solving them. They're really efficient at getting back to their baseline quicker than most. And so I look at it as like a squiggly line. Like if you just look at a squiggly line that's like really high highs and really low lows, those are average performers, because they have a lot of time in between. But for really high-end performers, they still have highs and lows. The squiggly line is just a lot different. It's shorter in nature.
So you mentioned an aha moment a while ago now, because I selfishly took up some of your time from a personal point of view. But you had an aha moment in Starbucks, didn't you? There was a specific conversation that's been a real impetus for the rest of your career. So why don't you just unpack that specific exchange for us?
I'm just going to put this out there. I feel like Starbucks should give me some sort of affiliate, because I talk about them in every podcast I'm in. But seriously, shout out to Starbucks, because working there actually changed my life. I was fresh out of grad school. I had 2 job offers on the line. They both fell through, which was devastating. I needed to start paying my bills. I had my master's degree, student loans coming up. So I got a job at Starbucks. And this one day in this one particular customer changed the entire trajectory of my life and my career. And I was working the drive-thru. And when you're working the drive-thru, it is your job to keep the client entertained while their drink's being made. So this gentleman's drink's being made and I'm chatting it up with him. And he asked me if I was in school, which is a very common thing. Most people were studying something. And I said, no, actually, I just graduated. And he was like, oh, that's awesome. Like, what'd you get your degree in? And like, here I am. I'm so proud of it. So I'm like, I can't wait to tell this guy. Like, I'm like, oh, finally, someone who cares. And I was like, oh, I got my degree in performance psychology. And he just starts laughing. And not the kind of laughing that's like laughing with you, or it was definitely like at me. And so I'm so confused, but I'm also very direct and have no problem with an uncomfortable question. So I finally just asked him, I said, what's so funny? And he goes, oh, you got one of those degrees you'll never use. And my mouth like just dropped open. Like, I couldn't believe this guy said this to me. And you know when somebody says something to you and it just like plays in your mind like a broken record, and I just was ruminating on this like time and time again. Like, I couldn't even hand him his drink. Somebody else had to hand it to him. I was so pissed. I wanted to throw my coffee at him, or his coffee at him, but I did not. But in my mind I did. And every time I like reheard him say this to me in my head, I started to get more and more upset and re-experience all the emotions all over again. And then I had this moment where I was like pissed because I was pissed. I was like, Lauren, this guy has absolutely no bearing on your life. Like, you don't know him. He doesn't know you. Why are you giving him so much power over you? And that's when I had this like light bulb moment. And I realized I wasn't mad because he was rude. I was mad because he was right. You're not going to get very far if you turn around at your first sign of adversity. And here I was turning around and just waiting for another job opportunity to fall in my lap. And so, sure, like maybe his statement wasn't entirely true, but it hit a nerve because part of it was truthful. I wasn't doing anything to find a new path. And so that evening, I actually Googled how to start your own consulting company and started my own consulting company. And the whole purpose was to get experience so that when the right job came along, I had it on my resume. And I did that for a year's time, and I landed my dream job at the time.
He was very wrong in the end, which is nice. It's a nice end to the story, really, isn't it? But it's funny how a lot of the things that upset us the most are when we've had a mirror shone in our face, and ultimately there is a layer of truth in it. And I think that's where the one of the biggest lessons I've learned over the past couple of years from a relationships, workflow, business point of view is just extreme accountability on things. Because if you are the sort of person that gets pissed off when you get called out on having dropped the ball or made a mistake, then that is the mirror being shown back in your face. If you can't learn to deal with that through repeated exposure, then there's something that's going to be systemic over time. So the accountability that came from that, you immediately reacted to. And I find it funny how you said you were pissed off and being pissed off, because I'm sure there were lots of studies and references and things you probably said to other people that you've suggested they implement. And you're like, Lauren.
It was that ultimate honesty that I'm not sure I could have received from anyone I knew. That's why it was such a gift, because this guy didn't know me. And even though it was not the nicest thing to say, honestly, I needed it. And if I saw that guy today, I would hug him. I would say thank you, because really I needed somebody to shine that mirror, shine that light on those areas that I was ignoring and that I was making all these excuses for just to remain comfortable. But really, the second I took that leap and I started to lean into that discomfort and I started to chart my path in alignment with the things that I knew I wanted, like, man, so many opportunities and doors began to open.
Imagine if he's listened to all these podcasts and he just sits in a sports bar somewhere with his friends being like, that was me. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing. But no, it's fascinating how much something like that can actually just skyrocket trajectory, and it did. So the consultancy business, what did you, essentially going straight into that, there must have been some really, really harsh lessons that you learned quite quickly. And you are quite well equipped to be able to manage the stress and adversity that goes with them from a personal point of view. So what were the biggest lessons that you actually carried from that into what became the dream job?
I actually had to redefine success to be within my control. That was my number one focus, because I knew that, especially starting a new consultancy business, like nobody knew me. I had no name behind me. I was fresh out of grad school. Like, I didn't have a lot of weight carrying behind me. I had a degree, great, but there's a lot of people that have that. So I knew that I had something to offer. And whenever I got in front of people, I was able to get the buy-in. And so I'm like, if I could just get in front of people and do really good work, I knew that people like to work with people who do insanely good work. So that was my only goal. My goal wasn't monetary. My goal wasn't the amount of clients, or necessarily like I had a type of client I was going for, but that wasn't like the end all be all. My goal was to get as many reps as possible and to do excellent work. And what ended up happening is, little by little, like a little became a lot. And I started to get these, like I would get one person to say yes, and then they would talk to their friends, and then they would say yes. And then I would get reached out to by this company. And then I reached out to a Sacramento State baseball, which is like local to me, a Division I baseball team. And they said yes. And so I just started getting all these chances, and I treated every chance, regardless if I was getting paid, not paid, I paid a lot, paid a little. I would treat each one as if they were my dream client. And it began to kind of snowball to the point where I actually got an opportunity to interview with the New York Yankees, and I got the job.
You did indeed. And that's a lot of where I can imagine the lessons that you carry through to everything that you do now have really come from that, because the exposure to high performance. And I spoke to somebody the other day, the rate at which baseball is played, I knew it was played frequently, but it is chaos. There was one of he was actually the in-house chef and nutritionist for the Red Sox. He's coming on board as an athlete of ours with Omnia as a business, and he showed me the calendar. I was like, I knew it was like 3 games. It's so frequent, isn't it? So that squiggly line that you referred to is chaos. The squiggles are almost indiscernible across the course of the year. So when you landed, what were the first things that you felt you needed to tackle? Was there anything that you thought, oh wow, they are way off the mark here? Or were there things that you thought were being done well? What was the first sort of project that you felt needed the most attention?
It actually was, I'm pretty lucky. I walked into a pretty well-oiled machine when I got there. However, the only thing I focused on was building relationships. You can't do what I do without a solid foundation of relationship. And I remember my director at the time, he said, I don't care if you do one mental performance session. I just want you to build relationships for this first year. Yeah. And ironically, when that's the focus, similar to doing good work, the results come on their own. And so within 2 weeks, I already had players asking to meet with me. And that to me is a result of only focusing and not only being there for them, caring about them and putting them first, but just learning about them and them learning about me. Because also, like, rewind several years, I was the first woman in player development. So that alone was a shift for everyone. They didn't know what they could say around me, what they couldn't say. Like if they didn't want to offend me, it's almost as if they thought I've never heard a cuss word in my life. And so every time somebody would drop an F-bomb, they'd be like, Lauren, I'm sorry. I'm like, you guys, like, please just continue on, like, with exactly how you're operating. Like, but that I think was a bigger change for them than necessarily anything else. And then once they started to get to know me and get comfortable around me and understand the work that I did, everything else kind of followed.
Was there any resistance to you being viewed, again, it's an American word, as almost a shrink, as a mental weakness to be discussing things that were a bit more internal, a bit more mental health driven from a performance point of view, because I mean, men especially are really quite bad in a performance setting, in a day-to-day setting, at tackling these things head on. But after 2 weeks, that feels like there was a real good uptake. Was it a few specific players? Was it a few specific leaders? Or was that eroded by the fact that you'd spent so much time building the relationship where it was almost sleight of hand? Here they were sitting, talking to you without knowing what had happened.
Well, like, yeah, that too. But yeah, I think that, like I said, when I came in, mental performance was not foreign to them. They knew what I did, but I also made it I made a very strict distinction between mental health and mental performance. Mental health, like, we can't really do a lot from a mental performance perspective if we don't have a strong foundation from a mental health perspective. Now, what I don't do is, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a therapist. Like, I don't treat and diagnose clinical disorders. And so that I made a very strict distinction about that, of what I did and what I didn't do, so that they understood that when they're sitting with me, like, it's not me just like saying you have a problem and there's something wrong. It's like, no, how can we take what you already do really well and take it to the next level and be intentional about it? And so that was very interesting to a lot of our athletes, because they're always trying to find an edge. But the one thing that we are up against sometimes is people's past relationship with other mental performance coaches. Sometimes they don't have a good experience. So I remember being up against that with a couple of our players. And then also cultural. There are big cultural differences. And so certain cultures view it weak. No matter what, if the word mental is in it, it is weak and you shouldn't do it. And so I think that you have to take all those factors into consideration when you're in a system like that, and make sure that you aren't just approaching it as if, oh yeah, this is normal for everyone, because it's really not. And you have to meet people where they are. And I always say this, the worst mental skill is a forced one. And so never, ever would I ever force anybody into what I would share. I would always say, hey guys, if there's something that you can take out of this, take it, but feel free. Anything that doesn't fit with you or is in alignment with you, like, throw it in the trash on the way out. But my job is to offer some suggestions to you in some of our group sessions and create a discussion so that we can open our minds to these possibilities and other tools that we can use to really level up our performance.
So what were the prevailing challenges that the players were dealing with? Because I can imagine, obviously, that, like you were saying before, the self-worth attached to a batsman is pretty binary, and there's other positions on the field where it is quite binary. And my brother sat behind the screen I'm looking at now. He was a professional cricketer and he was a batsman, which means it's very easy for your viewpoint on things to be defined by the number of runs that you score, even though you were saying before, obviously, that separation is required to be able to unlock that higher level performance within an individual. In a group setting, in an individual setting, what were the things that were coming up most that you were making suggestions on to overcome?
Well, I think that everything falls into these three categories, and I call them my 3 C's, which is clarity, like understanding what you want, why you want it, the direction you're going, and being in alignment with that. Because some players didn't really know what they wanted out of, like, working with me. And so clarity was so important. 2 was choices. Like, once you have clarity, it can create a decision filter to the choices that you're making. And so now choices fall either in alignment with that or outside of alignment with that. And so then we go, okay, what choices do we have? And what's getting in the way of us making the best choice in certain situations? And that's where we can really dive into that weed in the root example as, like, okay, if this is presenting itself, what choices are we making in response to it? And how can we upgrade those? Or how can we make decisions to avoid those things happening in the first place? So that's the choices piece. And then if we create systems around our choices, then we can create consistency. And so sometimes we would be like, okay, so you've made some really good choices. That's amazing. We know that this works. We know this is the direction we're headed in. And then how do we systemize it? How do we make your process more efficient? And so I take this from actually computer science. It's called refactoring. And when you refactor a code in computer science, you essentially take an existing code and you want to achieve the exact same outcome, but you shorten the code to get it. And so it's almost like, if the code is 10, letters long, how can we, make it into 4 and still achieve the same outcome? It's how do we cut the fat to make it the most efficient as possible. And so sometimes the work that I'm doing is systematic in nature, where we're actually trying to make it them more efficient, even though they're still eliciting a good result. And then lastly, if they're doing the same thing time and time again, the worst thing that we can do, I mean, consistency is great, but you can consistently work in the wrong direction as well. And so just because it worked once doesn't mean it's going to work again. So we also want to create an evaluative tool that makes us go, okay, how are we doing? Is this still eliciting what we want? If not, what do we need to change from a clarity perspective? And then it kind of goes through those 3 C's again. But all things, whether it's confidence, whether it's struggling with their own self-worth, whether it's dealing with outside stuff with their family and relationships, all those things kind of fall into that flow. But sometimes they fall in different places.
Are there any general actions or habits or processes or even, I guess, mental toolbox things that you can apply to any situation that warrants high performance that people can apply in any setting? Because I can imagine there's so much crossover between, for example, somebody performing at a high level in Goldman Sachs versus for the New York Yankees in terms of how the actual application of their expertise to the task at hand unfolds. So without, obviously you can't be overly prescriptive, but in terms of general considerations, what's on the table?
Yeah, there's this one story that I love, and it also sticks out to me. We had a guy, he was 17 years old, taken in the draft right out of high school. And he was like the guy, right? Like in his area, like he never lost. He just was like the man. So he gets drafted by us, comes into spring training. And at spring training, we have all of our teams in the same place. And there's a sim game going on, and they put him in to pitch against AA and AAA hitters. Now, if you know baseball, you know that AA and AAA hitters don't miss. So if you're not on your shit, like it's not going to be good for you. I knew what they were doing. The pitching coaches were going to try and see how he dealt with adversity, because up until this point, he'd really never failed. So what we think is going to happen happens. He just gets beat up a little bit. It's like double, triple, home run. I mean, he is just like defeat is written all over his face. They end up pulling him out. And after the game, he comes back to my office and he is like distraught. He's like, Lauren, like, I don't know what happened. Like, I don't know what to do. Like, that's never happened before. And I just was like, all right, hey, come sit down. Let's chat. And so I asked him, I said, what happened out there? And he's like, I actually don't remember. He's like, he's like, I feel like I like blacked out when I was out there, which to me, it's pretty in alignment with being a 17-year-old, just lacking some self-awareness and letting the moment kind of speed up on him and take over. And that's okay. It's not uncommon. He's right where he needs to be. So what I said is I was like, well, I want you to go watch video, but after every game, bullpen, anything like that, I want you to actually answer these 3 questions. Very simple evaluative questions, which is what went well or what did I do well? What can I do better? And what did I learn? 3 really simple ones. I mean, you can answer with 1 word, a page, whatever it feels right for that day. But what it's going to end up doing is we're going to increase our awareness post the moment. And as we increase our awareness, that awareness is going to start to draw near to the moment itself. And we'll also notice patterns of behavior in that way. So I gave him this task. He's like, okay. He kind of calmed down a little bit. Well, he leaves. The next day, we're in the cafeteria, and the cafeteria is packed. It's not a very big room, but it's packed. There's probably like 250 people in this room. And I'm at the front of the line, and he's all the way at the back, and the line would get kind of long. And he yells from the back of the line. He goes, hey, Lauren. And I swear to God, like everybody turned around. And I turned around, I'm like, yeah, what's up? And he goes, I did my journal exercises. And I'm like kind of cracking. I'm like, cool, man. That's awesome. Like, I'm glad you did. And then he goes, just kidding. And the whole cafeteria goes silent. I turn around, continue getting my food, have my lunch, and I go back to my office. And I shoot him a text and I said, hey, don't worry about, the journal exercises. I kid you not, within 2 minutes, he runs back to my office and he's like, Lauren, like, what do you mean? What do you mean? Like, I'll do them. And I was like, no, it's okay. Like, you don't need to do them. Like, just do them if you're doing them for you, but don't do them for me. And he's like, no, Lauren, I'll do them for you. And I was like, you're not getting it. I said, I'm not your mom. I'm not your teacher. I'm not your sister. I said, I'm your mental performance coach. And I said, whether or not you choose to do your journal exercises, like, it doesn't matter to me. Like, I'm going to go to sleep the same. I'm going to wake up the same and do my job at a high level the same way I did today. And he just continues to go, no, Lauren, I'll do them for you. And I'm like, no. I'm like, here's the thing. If you don't do them for yourself, you're just wasting your time and effort. When you take responsibility for your own development, that's when you'll start to see a change. So remember, you came to me for the reason that you didn't perform the way you did and you didn't understand why. This will help you understand why. But I said, do not do it unless you do it for yourself. So he walks out, and that night I got a photo of his first journal entry, and every entry after that, he sent me a photo. And so the point of it is, if you don't take responsibility for your own performance, no one else will. It's not your coach's job. It's not your spouse's job. It's not your friend's job to make you better. It's your job. And when people come to me, I'm not going to teach a CEO how to CEO better than they already do. I am going to be able to direct them in a direction where they can begin to help themselves, but I can't do that for them. And so I think the point is that whoever's listening, it's about being able to take responsibility for your own development, because what keeps people average is not their ability, but their actions. And so once you begin to upgrade your actions, you'll be surprised at how your ability and outcomes follow.
And do you recommend for everybody listening that needs to do that work, it's the same 3 questions?
Yes, and I'll explain why. So I like to start with well, because our brain has a strong pull towards the negative naturally. And so I like to start with a well, because no matter how bad your situation is, there's always if you can find something good, even if it's, all right, well, this was an opportunity to exercise patience, even though it sucked. This was an opportunity to, sit in adversity, even though obviously I wish I didn't have to do this in the first place. If you can find something good and hunt the good stuff, you are flexing your optimistic muscle. And what we know is that people that are optimistic tend to perform better over long periods of time than people that aren't. And so number 1 is well. Number 2 is better, because no matter how good you are, there is always room to improve. And so I want to make sure that even though you have an excellent outcome, let's not allow that to create a blind spot to improvement. And then the third one is, what did you learn? I used to not like this one. It reminded me of school. Like, oh, what did you learn today? But I actually found that people like this the most, because they end up pulling out the biggest principle that they found, like that core principle that they learned from a certain moment, that then allows them to carry it through to the next. So those 3 questions are great ones. They're simple, they're easy to remember, and they begin to reveal not only patterns of behavior, but help to improve our awareness to the moment that we're in.
So with the, let's say, overwhelming amount of information on optimization, high performance through evening routines, morning routines, this, that, the other, buy this thing, don't buy this thing, do this thing, don't do this thing. Do you think everything can have utility for an individual if it can fit within those 3 questions within the right framework? Because if you go through an experience and learn to be able to move forwards effectively, then trial and error essentially becomes the key to optimize for the individual. I generally feel that optimization in general can't be applied as prescriptively as it necessarily is. So what is your take on the Twitter sphere of information around these things when it comes to high performance? Because everybody that's ambitious is looking for that next thing. It's, how do I level up my day-to-day? How am I 1% better every day? What can I take from that podcast, that video, that supplement line, whatever it might be? Is it as simple as placing everything with the framework of try it, ask those questions, reflect on it, be honest with yourself, and move forwards with action?
Yes and no. I think it all depends on the goal on the other side. If your goal is optimization, my question would be, what are we optimizing? Are we optimizing your efficiency? Are we optimizing, your energy? Are we optimizing, your direction to your process to, pregame? Like what are we optimizing? That would be my first question. But the reason why I like these three questions and why I think it does help to support what you're talking about is because it's not necessarily prescriptive to any one thing, but what it does is it creates an awareness. And then it also creates that, okay, is this working for me? Because I do think that I see a lot of athletes that will take on something because so-and-so did it. Like, oh, well, because this worked for CC Sabathia, or, oh, well, this worked for Alex Morgan, or, oh, this worked for, fill in the blank. And they try on somebody else's, clothes per se. And then when it doesn't fit, they're like, well, it must be me. But the truth is we are all so unique and our processes should reflect that. And so sometimes the only way to know, to your point, is to try it on for size. And to try it on for size, and asking the question, is this in alignment with what it is that I want? And if it is, it might be worth trying.
Is there anything from a scientific point of view that you see as universally applicable in terms of a technique or a way of analyzing or a way of looking at things so that we can reflect on ourselves to learn the lessons needed to move things forwards? Because again, journaling as a concept is very popular.
Yeah.
Box breathing is even a great way of calming you down, and people will reference that as the cure to all evil if they're far enough down the sort of Kool-Aid on that one. Everything has these own camps now, and it's very confusing to determine what should I, the individual looking to, let's say, improve my relationships, improve my KPIs at work, whatever it might be. Are there any methods that you think for the general person that's just trying to navigate life as best they can, that they can implement simply to better understand how they interact with their own mental performance and therefore, I guess, the world on a day-to-day basis? It's how do we improve the human condition? Biggest question I've potentially ever asked on a podcast, so no pressure. But I guess in simple terms, it's what can listeners do to think about things a little bit more critically to cut through the noise?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I honestly think there are so many different answers. But the thing that's kind of coming to mind for me right now is the idea that one way to measure our mental toughness is how affected you become by things outside of your control. The less affected you are by things outside of your control, the more mentally tough you are. And so I think one good tool or strategy that people can use to start to foster that ability to see the difference between those two things is, I actually call it and I'm not the only person, I know a lot of people have used this before, but it's called the circle of control. And you just take out a piece of paper and draw a circle in the middle of it. And in the middle of the circle, write all the things within your control. And on the outside of that circle, write all the things outside of it. And allow that to serve as just a visual representation of what's within your control and what's outside of reach. Because in any given situation, if you can define those two things, you understand where your power lies and where it doesn't. It doesn't mean you can't give effort to things outside of your control, but your power is not going to be as effective as if you direct it to the things within it. And so I do think that if we can help people define those two things, we can make better choices, better decisions, and I would even go as far to say, as from a journaling perspective, be able to become more aware of the things that we can and cannot do.
It's the Jocko Willink approach of bad thing, good. It's how do you assess these things? I mean, the mechanism for me is exposure to difficult endurance and physical challenges and events and things, and that's kind of the mechanism that I really buy into, because it's within our control to put ourselves in situations out with our control. And I'm like a child looking forward to hallucinating 42 hours with no sleep down at the end of the month, even though that scares the shit out of me.
Yep.
It's something that I know will make me, the person I will be at the end is a different person at the start. And I think that's where I, over the years, have noticed when, for example, a car has a huge bill that you just have to deal with, it doesn't send me into an emotional spin where I catastrophize. It's just, okay, how do we make this work objectively? What conversations need to be had? What do we need to do? move on, move on. And that's something that I attribute to repeated exposure to increasingly difficult things on my own terms. But I think something I'll push back a little bit against on is get comfortable being uncomfortable is a very popular narrative. It's become very cliched, even though it's very applicable.
Yes.
But I think the nuance is if you can try and go looking for get uncomfortable being uncomfortable on somebody else's terms, I think is the level above that isn't necessarily as popularized on Twitter threads and Instagram posts as much as it might need to be. Because ice baths, good example. They're uncomfortable. You get into them. You overcome that inertia of I don't want to do this. You do it. Great. That's a win for the day. Move on. But if you're working at your desk, let's say, and somebody chucks you in an ice bath, how you react to that is going to be very different to how you do standing in a towel out your front door and then getting in for 5 minutes and then getting back in for a warm shower. So I think it's the question I often ask myself is how can I increase the dosage of things that are out with my control that I don't have control over to make me better at dealing with things like incidentals, the economy, government decisions that I disagree with, all these things that can really weigh on our minds quite heavy. And there are a lot of things that you see online that weigh quite heavy on the mind these days. It's chaos out there. So what do you think people should be aspiring to do? Are there any KPIs, are there any metrics that you recommend people try and work into their life to make forward progress in this so that they can actually monitor their progress with what's in the circle versus what's out?
Yeah, really quick though, because what you said I thought was really interesting because it made me think of like I travel quite a bit, and where that applies to me is that whenever there's a delay or we have an issue with a plane or whatever that is, like that sucks. Like there's nothing worse than trying to get where you're trying to go and have something that you have zero control over be the thing that delays you from getting there. And I just got back from a trip and a friend of mine, she got stuck. Like she's traveling back to Australia and she got stuck in Dallas for 2 extra days. She has a toddler. She didn't have a place to stay. It was like a whole thing. And I have actually now trained myself to the point where when that happens, I try to, number one, seek the gift, and I try to go, okay, I can't control this. So what can I control? I can always control the way that I look at it. I can always control how I reframe it. And it seems simple and it might seem cliche, but it actually changes your experience around it. And so when you can change your experience, you can change how you actually live on a day-to-day playing field. And so I know that stuff doesn't actually upset me as much as it used to. And so if I can find myself in a mood that is actually more consistent with where I want to be, I can actually enjoy those moments, believe it or not. Or I actually just don't get totally taken down by them and just pissed off at the world. Because trust me, I have. And so that's how can I put myself, whether it's my mood, whether it's the way that I look at something, whether it's my perspective, whether it's the energy that I feel, more in a place where I want it to be, because that's how I would like to live my life every day, knowing that I'm going to have moments of, where it doesn't align with that. That's what I'm after. And so even optimizing my perspective, my frameworks, because what we know is that the frame matters more than the picture itself. The way that you look at something actually matters more than the actual thing that's happening to you, because the way that you interpret your data actually changes how your body responds to that data. And so that's why I find that that's really important. So what you described to me is just another opportunity, but oftentimes opportunities are gift wrapped in frustration, potentially pain, discomfort, fear. And so if we can look at those things as, oh, this is an opportunity to practice this skill, it's amazing how our brains could try to meet it.
And like you said earlier, the perfect embodiment of everything you just said is the guy at the drive-thru, because he forced you to go looking rather than looking for the opportunity in the adversity to come, rather than just waiting for it to occur. And ironically, probably spike on the squiggly line again. The peaks and troughs aren't quite as aggressive. It's more of a steady line with some bumps in the road up and down. And that's. Is there any risk of becoming emotionally numb along the way? Is there any risk of desensitizing yourself to the emotional response that we have as human beings that can spill over into other elements, where it becomes more difficult to feel somebody else's emotion or be empathetic? Anything scientifically or that you've experienced that falls into that?
I'll start with this. given what we've talked about, no, I don't see that as an issue because you're actually forcing yourself to feel it. You're forcing yourself to feel it. And then you're also looking at, is there like what typically helps in moments like these? And I know for me, what typically hurts is continuing the narrative of I should be on that plane. We should already be home. This is so frustrating. Like that narrative actually makes it worse. And so when I look at it that way, I actually don't think that there's a unless you're lying to yourself or unless you're trying to hide from the emotion itself, I actually think what it does is it forces you to actually evaluate it and look into it. Where I have felt numbness before, we actually had a scout at the Yankees, and she was, I believe, the first full-time female scout in all of the MLB. And she was just absolutely amazing. So well respected, so good at her job, just lovely to be around. And she actually came down with cancer. I believe it was ovarian cancer. And within like a year or two, she lost her life. And I remember sitting in my office and having our players that were, drafted by her and that knew her really well coming in, for support. And I had to put the grief I was feeling to the side to support them. And I remember having a really hard time accessing my feelings after that because I had forced it away. I'd pushed it away, and I was so numb to the situation. It was so foreign that I actually called my therapist because I was like, what's happening? I don't know what's going on. And it was just this big defense mechanism that I was putting up, and it was blocking me from experiencing any of that. So I'm curious to know, have you ever experienced something like that before?
Yeah, I have. It's why I asked in many ways, actually, because I feel like I'm in a good place in my life now where I can, for the most part, it is what it is, most things. And I found a little bit in the past 18 months that there's been some more emotionally challenging situations where I've found myself, I don't want to say not caring,
right,
but trying to be very practical and pragmatic about it, as you often would tend to do if you're trying to be empathetic with somebody or understand them, but in a way that it's not connecting to emotion, it's just practical. And I found that's trickled through into some of my communications with a few people where I view things quite practically and binarily, and maybe they haven't received it in the way it was intended. But for me, it's just something I'm going to be conscious of because I don't want to. I want to be able to enjoy. I think it's slightly affected my ability to be completely present in situations because I've almost trained myself to be fiercely practical about looking at everything in a certain way, which is very rewarding in many ways. But I feel at points it's taken me a couple of days or a little bit longer than it should to almost embrace the enjoyment of a situation or the love in a situation, whatever it might be. It's not something that concerns me, but it's just something I've caught myself thinking about a little bit recently, whereby I don't want to. I mean, I'll be entirely honest. The thought I have had within the past 12 months was, if a family member passes away and I don't feel the level of emotional connection that I feel is warranted, I would be kind of disgusted with myself. And it was kind of a forward-thinking, let's get ahead of this in terms of the way that you think about this, because that's not somewhere that you want to be. But obviously, until that situation comes, God forbid, hopefully it doesn't anytime soon, I want to try and make sure that I hold myself accountable to that thought, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it almost starts, the question that pops in my head is do you have enough capacity? Because I find that the numbness feeling begins to occur, that defense begins to occur when you actually are more in survival mode because your capacity is so drained to be able to meet the needs, your own emotional needs. And one of the things that I think is really important when we're looking at just overall well-being is that there's performance. Yes, I definitely tend to lean towards mental performance. That's what my, all of my education's in. However, I know that in order for mental performance to thrive, there's many other areas within our lives that also need to be firing as well. And they're gonna, ebb and flow based on, circumstances, life, all of that. However, those things, I think when those things become ignored, that's when we start to go into survivor mode in other areas. And so, for instance, my question would be, what would you grade your spiritual life? And I'm not saying religion and all that. Everybody has their own view of what that means. But then also your spiritual and your emotional. If you would grade those two areas of your life, how would you grade them? So
spiritual, funnily enough, I have a degree in theology and religion. I'm not religious. I'd call myself agnostic.
Okay.
And it's important to frame that because I have a very open-minded view to what spirituality means to me. And I found the biggest manifestation of it is vast outdoors. And training for me has always been a coping mechanism, a calibration point, whatever it is, but it's now very much part and parcel of my job. It's don't make work what you love, otherwise it'll become a sort of chore, not how the saying goes, but that sort of old cliche. I've kind of something I've experienced where training for me became work where it used to be a emotional and a spiritual component of the week. For about 2 years, I kind of didn't really register that, and then started to try and look elsewhere for that same connection. Recently, due to busyness, I've not found myself in the environments that I see a huge amount of spiritual connection and emotional connection to. 2 weeks ago, we did a couple of big training days up in the Scottish Highlands, which is where I'm going to be doing my big event. Vast, stunning, barren, infrastructure's terrible, roads are narrow, weather's awful, just everything that's not being in a city and being comfortable. And I felt immediately more connected to myself and the purpose that I was currently operating within just by being there. And I think emotionally that's made me a little bit more available and passionate about a few more things, but that's coming at a time of high stress. So the passion is sometimes manifesting as anger, but it's kind of productive anger. It's kind of figuring things out. So I think from a spiritual point of view, I'm missing the time in my week consistently away from work because I don't want to sound in any way. I'm very fortunate that a lot of the things that I love and are important to me are intertwined with what I do for a living. But I think that can actually blindside me when it comes to actually allocating the time for emotional and spiritual connection with the things that aren't work related. So often I try and protect Sundays to spend time at the beach with my wife and the dogs. But I've been working most Sundays for the past however many weeks, which means that time's gone. So the compounding effect of the work not having the break whilst also not having the sort of stimulus from the spiritual and emotional connection is probably very aggressively going upwards. And I've been thinking about this a lot where I'm trying to very much plan it in and actually time block it in for after the event, the 250 at the end of March. But it is very practically difficult to actually map that in without then dealing with the pressure of the workload along the way. So again, whilst you might not be mental health focused in terms of the discussions you've had in the past, it's been very useful to unpack for me a little bit because ironically, a lot of the lessons that I've learned through developing my resilience through big events have been applied to my wider life, but my wider life is so inextricably linked to work that it's very difficult to draw the line sometimes, which, for example, studio we're in now is a break point from the house because I was training at the house, had a gym in the house, running from the house, working from the house, deliveries to the house, where it became a workplace and not a home. And a friend of ours, Gaz Banford, he used to be Sergeant Major of the Special Forces. He was head of recruitment for the SBS and the SAS. He taught me about the concept of a third space. And I think this is kind of therapy 101. You've helped me discover. No, you've not really said much. You've just helped me. You've walked me through the garden for me to discover my own thing. Essentially, what I think I'm missing is that third space currently. I have my home, I have the office, but we train just outside that door there. I record podcasts in here. I work through there. And if I'm anywhere else, I'm traveling or I'm out with my usual routine, which means I am categorically missing a third space. So yeah, essentially, this has been very useful for me, Lauren. Thank you. Thanks very much. It's I need to determine a third space, but again, the exciting thing there is that I know through experience, if I can get back to that, then that will be a performance enhancer rather than an inhibitor, even though when you're stacked and busy and can't see a way through the things you're currently navigating, it's very difficult to think that it's like hiring, isn't it? In a way where it's difficult to see that investing in an employee is going to earn what you're paying the employee so that you can then continue to grow, in the same way that allocating time that you don't currently have on paper to something that isn't tackling the priorities, how is that going to help me tackle the priorities, even though all research supports the fact that it very much does. So I think my big lesson from today, sorry everyone for taking up all of the listeners' time here, is that I need to determine a third space for myself, because without that I'm constantly going to be going through this ebbs and flows, whereby if I'm not in the Highlands quite regularly, which is quite difficult practically, they're about 2 hours away, I will probably keep wrestling with this as time goes on. So there we are. That's a long-winded answer to your question, and one that was very illuminating for me, so thank you very much.
I think that it's powerful for everyone, because I will tell you that a lot of my high performers, they come to me for a performance reason, and whether it's in sport or their business, but it almost always traces back to their personal life. And it's because in order to achieve such high things, you have to sacrifice quite a bit of yourself personally. But if we do that for too long, it starts to become the norm, and that becomes the new habit. And then we find ourselves in places where either we're feeling numb, we're feeling unfulfilled, or we get to the end and we go, is this all there is? And so I think that it's a good lesson for all of us, is to make sure that we're also paying attention to that side of performance too. The things that personally light you up inside, like a spiritually, emotionally. And I know that for myself, I had a big lesson in this in the last year as well. And now I invest in either a retreat or a mastermind, because it actually brings me a level of fulfillment that I don't get anywhere else. So whatever that is for our listeners, I think that it's a good reminder for everyone to, check in on them and what their third space might be.
Yep, 100%. What was the trigger for you deciding you need to invest elsewhere this year, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, it was actually late last year in October. I went to a retreat in Tulum, and I actually almost didn't go. I was working with U.S. soccer. I just come back from the World Cup. I was away from my son for 44 days. I was traveling multiple times a month. I had 9 keynotes in September. I had my event coming up in November. I mean, I was just like burning the candle at both ends. And I just felt like there's something missing. Like I'm missing this connectedness with people. I'm missing this connectedness with myself. I'm so used to pouring into others, whether it's, pouring into my son, pouring into my husband, pouring into my clients, which all those things I love. But I totally neglected me. And my husband actually was like, you have to go. Like, you have to go. And so I ended up going. And it was the best investment I'd ever made in myself, because I'd never felt more connected, more aligned, more creative, more excited, more energetic in all those other areas when I invested in me. And I was like, this is so silly. I know this. Why have I not been practicing it myself? And so I actually recorded a video when I was there to myself as a reminder. So if ever I fell into that lull again, I can go back and rewatch that video to re-listen to my experience all over again and the reason why it's so important for me.
Fantastic. Fantastic. In the theme of this discussion that we're both having, what is the link in your mind between performance and happiness?
Oh, it's so good. Purpose. That's the link. Performance is great. Without a purpose, it's empty. And it doesn't have to be a huge, capital P purpose. It can also be something small that only you care about, or something that's temporary. But I think that when you make it mean something, you connect to it in a whole different way. And oftentimes, I know I'm speaking for myself, is that I am very achievement oriented. And if I'm not careful, I can just chase achievement because it's what I know to do. And what I found is at the end, I feel very empty when I don't have a purpose with it, a purpose that's either, bigger than me or a purpose that just really matters. So I find that the connection between the two is just having that understanding, why you do what you do.
I would agree, actually. It's a very succinct way of summarizing it, and would be a fantastic place to finish if I didn't have one final question, which is, how do you view performance as a parent?
I love this question. The way that I view performance as a parent has little to do, actually, has very little to do with outcome alone, but has everything to do with effort. And the reason I say that is because as a human being, like being able to put in quality, intentional, character-driven effort says more about you than any outcome ever will. And so I think that the performance I'm just thinking about my son, he's 1.5. So when I think about performance right now, there's like not much of that, right? It's just like, oh my gosh, like he remembers this color. That's amazing. My son's a genius when really he's just right on track. But I think that it's interesting because I grew up in a household that really rewarded positive outcomes without rewarding how you got there. And that's actually the root of my temporary worthiness. I received the most love when I had a positive outcome than when I didn't. And so it really supported me whenever I was achieving, I felt worthy of love. And when I wasn't, I felt very not worthy at all. And so as a parent, I think that if you're going to instill anything in your kids, I think a lot of it has to do with, especially from a performance perspective, it doesn't mean outcomes aren't important, but to your point, bring it all the way back. If you did everything within your control with the information that you knew to prepare yourself for the moment that you're in, wherever the chips fall, you can be okay with it. And I would be okay with that too.
Fantastic. I don't have kids for context, but it's something I'm always conscious of reflecting on, because I know the pressure that individuals and human beings put on themselves to get it right in a world, again, where there's so much information on what's wrong, what's right, and a lot of it is saying different things at the end of different it's impossible to discern. So no, fantastic way of looking at things.
And I think, and I'll just say this last thing, so I think it's important. I think it's important to treat yourself as a parent also similarly to anything else. It's like, we're going to get it wrong. We're going to say the wrong thing at the wrong time. Like, we're going to think we're helping when we're really hurting. And mistakes are only a mistake if we continue to make them and not learn from them. Like, if you consistently make the same mistake, you're not learning. But if you never make a new mistake, you're not growing. And so I think as a growth from a parent perspective is like, I know I'm going to get things wrong. I've gotten things wrong. And the idea is to learn and grow and show that learning and growth, and share that with your child. Man, there's nothing more powerful than being the example.
Fantastic. What a statement to finish. Really enjoyed that. Thank you. Genuinely, from a personal point of view, that was illuminating for me. And I feel less all over the place going into a very busy weekend. Busy being, I've got to run for about 13 and a half hours total, which is just an unfortunate thing to say out loud. But no, a genuinely massive thank you. And I'm sure for myself and for listeners, a huge amount taken away there. Where is the best place for people to find you online?
My website is probably the best because it'll direct you to all my social media channels, which have all different handles. And it's laurenjohnsonandco.com, and that's all spelled out, andco.com.
Brilliant. Thank you very much once again, and have a brilliant rest of the day.
Thank you.